Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It is really terrific to see this great crowd and, giving a warm welcome to our special guest. My name is Lace Thornburg, and I have the very great pleasure of working for Central Oregon LandWatch. Since 1986, LandWatch has played a leading role in shaping the Central Oregon way of life that you experience today. We review plans and policies at every level, from city to federal, and we steer important decisions toward more sustainable outcomes for our lands, waters, and wildlife. As a nonprofit organization, our watchdog work is possible thanks to our 979 members who support our work financially. And if this is your first event, then you're now a member. Welcome. Our Livable Future Forum, which we are kicking off tonight, is a chance to take a little step back from the law and policy work, although we will talk about a lot of law and policy, but take a step into the realm of story and imagination as well. And throughout the course of this event series, we're going to hear from 3 of the leading conservation voices of our time. They're going to share stories about what has worked, what could work, and what needs to happen if we're going to really confront this intermingled biodiversity crisis and climate change. And tonight, we're going to start with a conversation between LandWatch's Executive Director, Ben Gordon, and Tribal Leader Chuck Sams. I will tell you a little bit about my boss. Ben Gordon has dedicated his career to conservation and community. He came to LandWatch in June of 2020, and as you will recall, there was nothing going on in the world at that time that would be challenging to a nonprofit executive director, except a pandemic, a global reckoning with racial injustice, and a very turbulent presidential election season. In his 5 years at LandWatch, he's provided vision and strategic leadership as the scope of the organization has grown to meet the growing demands in the region. Prior to LandWatch, Ben held several roles with Oregon-based environmental nonprofits. He taught forest ecology for the Opal Creek Ancient Forest Center, served as a community organizer for the Oregon League of Conservation Voters and for 1,000 Friends of Oregon, and co-founded the High Desert Food and Farm Alliance to help make local food accessible to everyone. For 8 years, he served as program director for Oregon Natural Desert Association, and at ONDA, he helped establish the Tribal Stewards Program, where Native American young adults deepen their connection to their ancestral homeland while exploring career paths in natural resources and building marketable skills. On his way to working in Oregon, Ben conducted frog research for New Zealand's Department of Conservation, thru-hiked the Pacific Crest Trail, and earned his bachelor's degree in anthropology from the University of Colorado Boulder. When he is not working to ensure that all of you experience an unparalleled quality of life, he can be found foraging, running, cycling, or skiing through Oregon's wondrous and varied landscapes. Please, a quick round of applause for Ben. And now to introduce our guest presenter, I'd like to invite Mr. Austin Smith to the stage.
Tukti, Wigwa, Naika, Cleo, Kamayach. Good evening, my name is Austin Smith Jr. I am an enrolled tribal of the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs. My current title is Branch of Natural Resources General Manager. I have served this role for about 3 years now. Prior to that, I was a wildlife biologist, and my connection to Oregon State University Cascades is I'm a past graduate in 2015 from this campus. Actually, it was up on the hill. So I obtained a degree in natural resource management with a focus on wildlife management. So we are within the Confederate Tribes of Warm Springs ceded lands, and these are some of the areas where my tribes and many tribes in the area is utilized. Enough about me. Today I am honored to be introducing Mr. Chuck Sams, a national leader in environmental stewardship and tribal sovereignty, and a dedicated public servant. We are lucky to have Mr. Sams here with us tonight as he currently serves in an impressive trio of roles. Oregon's council member to the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, director of Indigenous Programs at Yale Center for Environmental Justice, and Oregon Tribe Scholar in Residence and Senior Fellow for the Native Environmental Sovereignty Projects at the University of Oregon. These roles follow after a historical appointment as the first Native American to serve as a director of the National Park Service. As director, he championed initiatives to expand and deepen tribal co-management, bolster climate resilience across the country, and promote equitable access to the public lands. Prior to that, he had served as an executive director and deputy executive director for the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation and held leadership roles with a broad range of organizations, including the City Volunteer Corps of New York, Earth Conservation Corps, the Columbia Slot Watershed Council, and the Trust for Public Lands, the Umatilla Tribal Community Foundation, and the Indian Country Conservation Education. Sams has also served in the United States Navy as an intelligence specialist with an attack squadron at the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Command with the Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters. His expertise was in Soviet-Russian affairs, Middle Eastern affairs, China affairs, and anti-terrorism. Sams holds a Master of Legal Studies, Indigenous Peoples Law from the University of Oklahoma City of Law. He also earned a Bachelor's of Science in Business Administration, Management, Communication, and Leadership at Concordia University. An enrolled tribal member of the Cayuse and Walla tribes with the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation, Sams resides in Pendleton, Oregon, with he and his wife Lori and their children. He loves to camp, hike, bike, hunt, and fish. And so I'm excited to learn from his vast experience and hear his insights. So please warm welcome for Chuck Sams.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Chuck, welcome. It is a great honor to get to speak with you tonight.
Good evening, my friends and relatives. My given name is Chuck Sams, but my Indian name is Mockingbird with Big Heart, and I come from the place of the Big Springs on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. And I'm so very pleased to be joining you all and for this invitation. Thank you.
Thank you. So Chuck, we heard a lot about your impressive professional resume, but if you would perhaps share a story or an anecdote that helps us better connect to who Chuck Sams, the person, the parent, the partner, the tribal member is.
Well, thank you. First, I want to thank Austin for that kind introduction. Austin has worked very closely with my sister, Corrine. My sister is an elected official for the Confederated Tribes Umatilla Indian Reservation. I'm just a grassroots tribal member now, so I get to complain to her a lot. But she and Austin have worked very closely together on salmon and watershed protection in the Columbia River Basin. And I want to say thank you, Austin, for your work as a biologist and now leading the Natural Resources Department for your tribe and your work and commitment to ensuring that generations from now that salmon will continue and our relationship with them will continue to thrive. And for you, our people, and the whole people of the Pacific Northwest, so thank you. I also want to acknowledge that in my opening, when I say, to my friends and relatives, I literally have friends and relatives in the room. My best friend, Mike Knepp, is here, who lives here in Central Oregon. He and I grew up together. We were calculating almost over 40 years of friendship, almost 50. His son, Adam Charles Knepp, yes, he's named after me. And then Kathy Kellen, who is the godmother to my youngest, Ruby, is here this evening. So thank you all for joining us. If we could bring up the first slide. So among the people of the Columbia Plateau, we know there was a time before human beings. And there was a time that my grandfather told me on the banks of Meacham Creek as a young child when Nishla showed up from the ocean. Nishla was the monster. And the monster came up out of the depths of the ocean and started to eat up all of the known world. And he literally came up into what we now call Oregon and Washington, and what is now known as the Columbia, or as we call it, the Nichiwana, the Big River, and was eating up the trees and the plant people, the eagle snatching them out of the air, the hawk, the fox, the coyote. The coyote, in particular, our trickster, was watching him from Pato, what is now called Mount Adams. I know these new names really throw me off. Names that have been around for thousands of years. And he was watching and he was scared because the animals were yelling for help. The creatures were asking for help and wanting to know if Coyote could do anything. So Coyote took off from the mountain and ran into the trees. And when he got into the trees, he ran into the Huckleberry Sisters and he said, Nishla's coming and he's eating up a whole known world. What do we do? And the Huckleberry Sisters told him, well, you've got to save everyone. Coyote said, me? Why me? Well, we'll teach you. And so they told him that he had to go and find some dry kindling so that he could build a fire. And then he needed to go find something to start flint so he could start that fire. So he ran out to the rocks and found these things and found some dry kindling. Then he told him to go find 5 sticks and sharpen those sticks. So he went out and he found those sticks and he sharpens those sticks. And they said, what am I going to do with all of this? Well, you got to be eaten by the monster. I don't want to be eaten by the monster. You have to. When you get inside, all the other creatures that are going to be in there, you're going to have to ask, how do I get to its heart? And you're going to feel your way around until you can get to its heart. And when you get to its heart, you're going to... What? I got to get eaten? Yes. Okay. So Coyote runs, gets to the top of the mountain again, and yells at Nishla, taunting him. Nishla, I'm here. You're ugly. Come eat me. Come get me. I'm still alive. I'm still here. And whoosh, Nishla eats him. When he gets into the gullet of the monster, he can see the eyes. That's all he can see of the other species. He can hear the cry of the plant people. Help us. Save us. Somebody. Anyone. Coyote says, I'm here, but I need help. How do I get to the heart? This way. Follow my voice. He starts making his way through the monster until he gets to the heart. When he gets to the heart, he starts laying out that dry kindling, and he gets his flint and he builds a huge fire into the heart. And now he can see the beating of the heart of the monster. And he takes his sticks and he starts cutting at the sinew of the heart all the way around. Until finally, as each stick breaks, he's down to his last one, and it finally falls. And when it falls, the monster belches and belches until finally he belches his heart out. And when he's belching the heart out, he belches out all the other creatures back onto the landscape. Out comes the mountains, out comes the rivers, out comes the trees, out comes the rocks, out comes the plants, out comes all the other animals. And they back onto the landscape. And out finally comes his heart. Eventually, my grandfather took me up into Nimi Poo country, Nez Perce country in Idaho. That's the heart of the monster near Winchester, Idaho. And that's where it landed. We're told that story because we're told the monster may come back one day. And like Coyote, we have to be patient, we must listen. We must be smart. We must be creative. We must find our inner strength to be brave in order to ensure that our relationship with flora and fauna will continue to survive and thrive on the landscape. Finally, human comes. One day, on a place called Sculpa Creek on the Umatilla Indian Reservation, I was probably around 5 or 6. My grandfather tells me, you know how you were made. I'm like, what do you mean? Well, you were made as a human being. One day, Creator decided to make this thing called humans, and he yelled out at Coyote, Coyote, come and talk to me. So Coyote climbs up Pato again, gets to the top, looks up, and says, yes, how can I help you, Creator? Throws down a medicine bag. He says, put this around your neck. I want to create this thing called human. But to do so, I need gifts from all the other living things to help me create this thing called human. Your job is to go collect these gifts on my behalf and then bring them back to me to help me create this thing called human. Okay, this is a good task. Coyote puts the medicine bag around his neck, and he runs down and he starts glissading down the mountain, singing to himself, looking around. As he looks up, he sees Eagle, so he stops and he yells out to Eagle, Eagle, this thing called human is coming. And Creator wants to know if you can give a gift. Eagle says, I'll give part of my eyesight, so this thing called human will be able to see the beauty of the world around him. This is a good gift. Down comes the eyesight. Coyote puts it in his pouch, and he thanks Eagle and makes his way down. He gets to the break of the trees. As he gets into the timber, he looks up and there's an owl, and he yells out to Owl, this thing called human is coming, and Creator wants to know if you can give a gift. Owl says, I'll give part of my hearing, so the Wachli, he will be able to hear the wind. He'll be able to hear the chatter that we are all talking about. He'll be able to hear the sounds of the water. This too is a good gift. He thanks Owl and he puts it in the pouch. As he's walking through the trees, he comes into a huge meadow and he yells out to the plant people, the cowsh, the wild strawberries, the wild carrots, and he yells out, plant people, this thing called human is coming, and Creator wants to know if you can give a gift. The plant people say, we will give part of our roots. This way it'll have a system by which it'll have nerves. It can nourish itself and pass it throughout its body. This is another good gift. Puts it in the pouch, walking through, thanking all of the plant people. As he gets to the edge of the meadow, there's an elk. Elk, this thing called human is coming. Can you give a gift? Elk says, I'll give it part of my hide so it'll be able to withstand the elements on the earth. All these gifts are coming, all from all the different animals, the flora and fauna. Finally, he gets down to the big river. And he gets down to Solala Falls. In the roar of the falls, the salmon are coming back. And as they're jumping up over the falls, he yells out over the echo, this thing called human is coming, and Creator wants to know if you can give a gift. Salmon pops its head up and says, I got 2 gifts. 2 gifts? Nobody is given 2 gifts. This is very special. What are your gifts, Salmon? 1, I will give of my voice completely. So this thing called human will have a language and will be able to speak to each other. It is said this is where we get the Chinook jargon that goes from the mouth of the Columbia all the way up into the headwaters of Canada today. Have you ever squeezed a salmon? Squeeze it as hard as you can to try to make a sound out of it? It doesn't make a sound. What is your other gift? Oh, I give up my body completely because I want it to be able to nourish itself. I want it to be able to have something to make itself strong. But before I give these things up, I need Creator to make a covenant with this thing called human he creates. That it be Waikanishnaq Nui Hluma, it be a keeper of the salmon, that it be a keeper of the flora and fauna. That for the gifts that it has received to become a human, it must steward these things for generations to come. This is how we were stood up. This is what we call Tamunwit. It's the law that we were given. Now the talk when I was talking with Lace, we were trying to figure out, the closest I can come to it in the English language is law of nature, when it's actually the natural law. But Tamunwit in the Sahaptin dialect literally just means to be stood up. And it's these gifts from land, from the water, from the flora and fauna that we receive that tell us and instruct us how we must be as human beings. Our responsibility on this earth to take care of those things that made us whole, who we are today. Among the Columbia Plateau people, the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, the Warm Springs, the Wasco, the Nez Perce, the 14 bands of the Yakima people, we have this covenant that we've made with the Creator to be a good steward, to follow this law, to speak on behalf of those who can't speak for themselves, especially with other humans, to teach and train each generation how to steward these resources so that they are here 7, 10, 12, 20 generations from now, that they not only survive, but they thrive. Because by keeping your promise, you're ensuring not your survival, but the survival and the life that is the planet. So Tamunwit and Tachum means the land, is what our land and our people are. I come from the Umatilla Indian Reservation. What you see before you is the map of the lands that we gave up to the United States. We granted land. So many times in the history books, even when I read, is the United States provided this land, these reservations to the Native people. That's not true. We reserved these lands for ourselves. These are the lands we negotiated. We granted 6.4 million acres to the United States. We reserved for ourselves what we thought was 500,000 acres, and it ended up being 250,000 because of a missurveying of the land in 1877. We come with an ethos that says we have limited wants with unlimited resources. I know I need shelter, I need heat, I need water, I need food, and I need love. And I have unlimited resources abound me. That's what I grew up understanding. So you can imagine how confused I was when I went to business school. And they told me I have unlimited wants and I have limited resources. I was like, I have unlimited wants? Yes. You want everything. I do? Wow. I went home and told my parents. They weren't impressed. And so how do you bring these two different ideals together has been a challenge, and it was the reason why I went to business school. My elders wanted me to go there. I actually didn't want to go. As you heard in my bio, I left as an intelligence specialist. I left on the China desk in the mid-90s, and I was very, very pleased to go back to school and finish an international studies degree and a Russian degree and go back to go work most likely for the CIA, who I was talking to. And my grandfather and his cronies showed up at the University of Oregon Law School conference, environmental law conference, and he left me with his buddies who said, so what are you doing for our people? I'm like, I'm sorry, what do you mean? Well, you're in school now, so what are you doing? Well, I'm going to get my international studies degree. I'm going to go back and go do my intelligence work. Okay, how's that helping us? I don't know. We want you to get a business degree. Well, I thought you guys wanted me to do environmental work. We do. We want you to get a business degree. Why? Because everything works on a month, a quarter, and a year in the dominant world. If you're lucky, it goes on a 4-year cycle, usually connected to their politics. We need to figure out how to tap into that in order to get the resources necessary to do the environmental recovery work we want to do. So we need to get a business degree. So I dropped out of U of O and I hid for a while because I didn't want a business degree. So when I finally consented to get a business degree, I said, okay, I'll get a business degree. Great. So I went to go re-enroll back at University of Oregon, get a business degree, and they said, where are you going? I said, University of Oregon. No, we want you to go to a Lutheran college. I don't want to go to Lutheran college, I'm Catholic. We know. We want you to go to Lutheran college because we need to understand the Judeo-Christian mindset as it relates to business and how they practice their laws. Oh, this is really confusing. I did it. And that's why I went and got those degrees. And it's giving yourself up to elders who see things that you don't see and look at you to tell you what your strengths could be or can't be, and being willing to learn from those. And I made a lot of mistakes along the way, but I learned that we still have limited wants with unlimited resources, that we were learning how to restore our balance, restoring who we were as a people, and what other people had been calling wilderness, we call home. As I traveled in my work in the environmental field across the United States, I would be taken to these areas that were called wilderness and wild areas, and I would then visit with the tribes, and I'm like, what do you call this area? Home. No, I mean, they call this a wilderness area. We don't have a word for wilderness. What's your word for wilderness in Sahaptin? That's a great question. I don't think we have one. The closest I can come is Chinook jargon, and it's skookum. And all that means is that something isn't straight. And we use it to mean crazy a lot of times if you call somebody skookum. But, I mean, that's the closest word we have to wild. Because the lands that we had, that 6.4 million acres, we knew like the back of our hand. But we actually had usual custom rights that went well beyond that into the territories that are now known as Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, Northern California, Southern British Columbia. And my grandfather and my granduncles were ensured that I knew every piece of that land and then went well beyond that to say that promise that we made, that we told you about, requires you to be a good steward of the flora and fauna well beyond your reservation, well beyond the 6.4 million acres we granted the United States. We reserved that right in the Treaty of 1855 to be able to hunt, fish, and gather in all usual custom stations. They think that's about hunting, fishing, and gathering. What that is about is managing those species to fulfill our covenant. Next slide. So this is why first foods are extremely important. Whether you're practicing among the warm springs, if you're very fortunate enough to go to their first food ceremonies, or you go to Yakima and the Longhouse there, or the Umatilla Longhouse, or Nez Perce, the order of the food, salmon is always first, because it's well, water is always first, because water is life. But right after that is salmon, because it sacrificed the most. It gave up of its voice, and it gave up its of self. And then it's followed by all those other species that gave something to us to create us as human beings. And it's in an order that we practice every season to remind ourselves of these gifts and to make sure that we're good stewards of those gifts. But over the years, we've had to deal with federal acts. These are 40 acts. There are over 400 federal acts written about American Indians. I say American Indians, not indigenous people, because American Indians is not an ethnicity. It is a political identity. We're the only group of people with a political identity that is specifically written in the Constitution in the Commerce Clause. No other group of people are written about. The American people are written about in the Constitution. We're the only other group of people identified in the Constitution specifically. And so we also have, that's why there's a whole subsection of laws just written about American Indians, which is why I went to law school, to try to understand and decode the words that were written about us. Because most of the time they weren't written for our benefit. They were usually written to restrict or to lessen a treaty right or an obligation the United States had to the Native people. And so if you have a chance to work with tribes, and I know Austin deals with this every day because we have a lot of organizations like LandWatch and others who come with a good heart and an open mind and wanting to work with tribes. And sometimes they wonder why the tribes work so slow. It's because they have to go back and work through these issues to determine, where does this fit? How does this work? Is this the right legal tool? Is this the mechanism and lever I have to pull in order to make this work? And I have to protect my sovereignty as a tribal nation and my relationship with the United States, let alone the subdivisions of the state, the county, a municipality, or any other subdivision thereof. We get to modern conservation, which is what I've spent most of my life, adult life, working in. And I'm always amazed at the American conservation model, because very early on, it was actually a pretty generous model. When I look at Catlin, some great protecting policy of government, preserve a large expanse of land in all its pristine beauty and wilderness, where the world could see for the ages to come the native Indian in his classic attire galloping his horse and fleeting herds of elk and buffalo. There was an actual thought, okay, we will put these lands aside and we'll let the Indians live out their lives and we will stay away. Thoreau, the eloquent savage, uses nature as the symbol. He looks around him in the woods to aid in his expression. His language, though more flowery, is less artificial. What Indians have a word for, they have a thing for. But within less than 50 years, you get John Muir, the father of modern day conservation. Indians are diggers, fallen, ugly, some of them altogether hideous, no place in the landscape. As National Park Service Director, I had the good fortune of going to his house, which, by the way, is his wife's house. It's not his. And all of his travels were underwritten by, guess who? His wife. Because she had all the money. She owned all the land. Her father owned all the farms and underwrote all of his travel. And we went into the basement. By the way, all his manuscripts are still there. And we started looking. I challenged the staff. I said, we went into the room. They showed me the room where he wrote his manuscripts and his books. And I said, let's go look at the original manuscripts. And they were like, why? I said, I want to show you something. So we went down, put on the gloves, and we started looking through his original manuscripts. And most of them had not read some of the more details. He was never alone. He had many times 3 to as many 7 native guides with him at Yosemite who were showing him all of these places. And then he took them out of those notes, left them out, and rewrote his manuscripts. These places that he discovered or found were actually shown to him by many of the Pomo natives that lived in the area. We tell ourselves these stories without really understanding that these lands weren't discovered, they were shown. They were already known. And the natives there were very pleased to show him these places because they wanted to share the grandeur and the beauty and hoping that they would be protected. Our people, whether it's the Kuna Chief, Wahi, the land is our culture, God named this land for us. Menainik, my strength is from the fish, my blood is from the fish. From the roots and the berries, the fish and game are the essence of my life. I was not brought here from a foreign country and did not come here. I was put here by the Creator. My late mentor and friend, Barry Lopez, said it best when he said, European imposition of their will was an incursion with no proposal to the natives of this land. Yet we must turn to each other and sense that this is possible. So what is possible still today? What can we all do together on this land? What can we do to continue to steward it, not just for ourselves, but for those generations yet to come that we will never see? To ensure that the flora and fauna are here, not just surviving, but thriving. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. Really, really appreciate that. I think it's safe to say I have a better sense of who you are now. So it sounds like your elders had a grand plan for you long before you knew it. And that path led you to the National Park Service under the Biden administration. You were the first Native American director of the Park Service, and you worked alongside Deb Haaland, the first Native American director of the Department of the Interior. Can you describe what that was like for you to work alongside her and all that you envisioned and accomplished together?
So, like many of my fellow American Indians and Indigenous people, we were extremely excited when President Biden made the announcement that he wanted, at that time, Congresswoman Deborah Haaland of New Mexico to serve as the first American Indian on the cabinet, serving as the Secretary for the Department of the Interior. It was just very exciting, and never in my wildest dreams did I think I would go to work for the administration. I had a long talk with my family when I found out that she was going and said that if there is a job with this administration, I feel compelled to return to federal service. After I'd left the military, I didn't, for all those years, I had no feeling of returning back to federal service. Matter of fact, in all those 30 years before that, I spent most of my time throwing rocks at the Department of Interior. Almost literally. Being very angry with them about U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Bureau of Reclamation, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, trying to get them to understand the things that I was talking to you all about of how we're doing stewardship and how there were competing ideals around protection, enhancement, preservation, the inability to pick their heads up out of their silos and look across the landscape and work on the landscape scale. And I sat in front of every sitting secretary since the Clinton administration making that argument. And so when the call did finally come, it was from a woman named Maggie Thompson, and Maggie and I are still very good friends. Maggie is now the Deputy Secretary for Natural Resources for the great state of North Carolina. But Maggie at the time was serving as the White House liaison for the President's Personnel Office. And she says, "Hi, Chuck, my name's Maggie Thompson. We've never met. I'm calling on behalf of the Department of the Interior Transition Team, and we'd like to know if you have any interest in being the 19th Director of the National Park Service." I laughed, an uncomfortable laugh, and she said, "Are you laughing at me?" I said, "Well, yeah, who put you up to this?" And she goes, "What do you mean? Is this a joke?" I am, no. I want to assure you I represent the White House Presidential Personnel Office and the Department of the Interior, and this is a real question. Oh, could I ask you who put my name forward? She said, yes, but first I need to know whether you're interested. Oh, yes. A huge honor. Yes, I'd be very interested. Great. She said, Bob Anderson, who ended up being the solicitor. Bob had been a wonderful mentor. I've known Bob for 30 years. Bob was on my advisory board when I was with the Trust for Public Land. And so as soon as we hung up, I called Bob and said, hey, how did I come to the list? And he says, I'm tired of you throwing rocks at the Department of Interior. Why don't you try to come on the inside and make changes? I talked to the secretary talked to the president. We'd like you to be our guy. But you should know, this is not an easy process. And so went through the process.
So Secretary Holland gave you a mandate to fiercely tell the entire truth, the entire story of events that transpired on the lands that under your purview you were responsible for. What was it like to reorient the narrative within the Park Service?
It was a huge honor to work for Secretary Holland. The day I was sworn in, they asked, where do you want to be sworn in? I wanted to be sworn in outside, and I asked to be sworn in on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I have great respect for President Lincoln because he was a man that knew that he was fallible. Here's a man that had barely a third grade education, and yet was a ferocious reader, went on to become a lawyer, went on to become a state legislator, went on to become federal, went on to become president of the United States. And he held the Union together. And when I was a young sailor, I'd been into the temple of the Lincoln Memorial and read the second inaugural and read the Gettysburg Address, and realized as a young sailor that if anybody was going to be the downfall of this nation, it wasn't going to be some power outside, it was probably going to be us, and that we are all responsible for this experiment of keeping the republic together and trying to form a stronger union. And the day that he freed the slaves and signed their proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, he also condemned 38 Dakota to be hung. I'd like to think that had he lived, because I knew that he learned from mistakes and errors and issues, that he may have found a way, while he freed one group of people, how to ensure the freedom of another group, but we'll never know. So I asked to be sworn in his shadow. So we were standing there on the second landing, and Secretary asked everybody to move out of the way so that she and I could talk. And we were standing and looking out onto the National Mall, and she said, on behalf of the American people, the President of the United States, and myself, I'm charging you with the preservation and protection and enhancement of these national parks, monuments, memorials, and historic sites. You must find those stories yet told and tell America's stories fiercely.
Thank you.
Then she told me to look at my feet. I was like, what? Look at your feet. I was standing on the spot where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. She said, you and I are in the embodiment of Dr. King's dream. Now we must keep it alive.
That's very powerful. You were given an invitation to remake the National Park Service, to reorient it. There's the kind of high level vision of doing that, and then the practical reality of having so many moving parts and such a large and cantankerous bureaucracy. How did you set about doing that?
First, you have to co-op all of the senior leadership. So there immediately people wanted to know, what are your directives? What is your plan? What is your goals? And I said, what I need to meet with all 38 members of the senior executive service. I'm going to give them an hour each. I want them to present to me what they do, how they do it, what are their goals, what have they been doing in their careers. And then from that, I came up with my 7 goals so that they could see a reflection of themselves in those 7 goals. That was 1. 2, I wrote it in plain English. My communication staff rewrote it for me twice and kept putting it in governmentese, and I kept writing it in plain English because I wanted it to be well understood. We wanted, a healthy workforce. We wanted to ensure that it was that we were working with tribes in a positive way, and that we were looking at these resources, cultural, natural resources, and we're going to take care of them on behalf of the American people. And we were going to find those stories yet told. And I was very happy to see not only the leadership embrace it, but the staff at every level trying to embrace it and figure out how do we move all of this forward.
With regard to the concepts of co-management and co-stewardship, those were ideas and a vision that you brought to the Park Service. Were they easy to get buy-in for, and what were you able to make difference as a result of those concepts?
So I was very pleased that President Biden and the Secretary very early on wanted to figure out how to work better with tribes all across the United States. The President had signed an executive order around consultation and co-stewardship. The Secretary followed that up with her secretarial order in partnership with the Secretary of Agriculture that eventually was a partnership with the Secretary of Commerce. And from that then went to all the bureau heads to figure out how we were going to do that. For 30 years, I've been trying to get the federal agencies within the Department of Interior to work with tribes better, based on treaties in the Pacific Northwest, saying that you have an obligation to co-manage these sites with us. Court cases. You go back to Winans' decision in 1905. You go to USB Oregon, USB Washington, the Bolt and Baloney decisions, all of them mandate federal agencies and state agencies are supposed to be co-managing with tribes, but federal agencies time and time again would find reasons not to. National Park Service was one of those who, when I showed up, had 5 co-stewardship agreements or co-management agreements out of their 400, at the time, 423 units. By the time we finished, we had 159. There was some pushback from the senior leadership. What I found out is most of them had never been told when they took their oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States that under Article 2 and under Section 6, when you said that you uphold treaties that the United States makes, that if you fail to uphold a treaty, you fail to uphold your office because you took that oath. And I had many people tell me, nobody's ever told me that before. And I thought, that's strange. Somebody should have. And so I saw a number of people, but a lot of junior staff willing to say, well, if that's my oath of office, I took that oath of office to defend the Constitution. If that means defending these treaty rights, then that's my obligation. That's what I have to do. That's my trust responsibility. And we saw for the first time staff not requiring tribes to come on to the park, but them going to tribes and asking, what do you want to do? There was a lot of scariness for superintendents, and I understood that. They thought that tribes were going to be asking them for money, and in some cases they did. But in the vast majority of cases, tribes showed up with their own money. They said, well, we're already doing restoration of natural grasses in the area. We just want to be able to get access onto the land to make sure it's continuity, landscape scale. We want to work on bison restoration at Yellowstone. We want to work on reducing fuels at Yosemite National Park. We want to work on sweetgrass propagation all across the system. And that, when the staff found out and superintendents found out that some of the tribes were showing up with money and resources, they jumped on and we saw the agreements. When I left, there were 50 outstanding agreements still under review. I will say that Secretary Burgum has signed 7 of those so far. I'm still hopeful the other 43 will eventually make their way through.
Great, thank you. So moving to Oregon specifically and public lands, I'm curious about a couple things. So Oregon has only one national park, Crater Lake, a state that is as beautiful and diverse as Oregon, could have many more. You have seen a lot of land designations and different assignments for land management during your time, your career. I'm curious if there are some designations that stand out to you as a better fit for truly caring for the earth and cultural resources than others. What do you have to say to that?
You know, there are a lot of different types of designations. All of them are human-made. You know, we just make up things. It's great. It's what I learned about law. I can make up anything I want. If I can get enough people to vote for it, it can become law. But flora and fauna don't care. What they want to know is that you're a good steward. What they're looking for is good stewardship. And so when I look at the different types of designations that we use, some are strong, but each of the different types of bureaus have different charges. Bureau of Land Management has a multi-use resource charge. That's how Congress charged them. And I understand how sometimes the environmental organizations get angry with them, but that's their charge. You're yelling at an agency rather than yelling at Congress. Congress is the one that gave them that charge. They're having to carry that out. My friend Tracy Stone Manning, I used to say to her, "You got that job, not me. Good luck." And she'd say, "Oh," and but she did a wonderful job of trying to figure out how to balance that out and how to meet that multi-use needs. I was very fortunate. The Organic Act of 1916 gives me a very clear charge: protect natural and cultural resources while ensuring that the land is for the enjoyment of the American people to recreate on. Those were strong. Natural and cultural resources we were to protect. That's our first mandate. I'm concerned now that that might be being put in the secondary and we're just recreating. But you talk to the staff, they are very, very focused on protection of cultural and natural resources because they understand the Organic Act. That's what it tells them to do first and foremost. But there are acts that I have concern with. The Wilderness Act, again, because it goes back to what everybody calls wild, we call home. It literally ignores Native people in the Wilderness Act. It ignores their understanding of Indigenous knowledge, negates their practices. Matter of fact, once the Wilderness Act was passed, the last settlements at Yellowstone and Yosemite were removed because the Wilderness Act was passed. And those settlements were razed to the ground. And we ended up with a lot of wildfires in those areas. Is that coincidence? Because the tribes up to that point had still been doing cultural burning in both of those parks.
Yes. When I was fortunate to have dinner with Chuck right before we came to have this conversation, and we were talking about rights of nature. It sounds like rights of nature is a bit more of an academic and legal construct, but there's a corollary, which is natural law, which is something that you believe very strongly in. Would you mind sharing with folks who aren't familiar with it a little bit about what it is and what it does?
So natural law are just that discussion of how I became human and the understanding that their law predates my being. They have a right to already be here. The water has a right to free flow from its source to the ocean. The birds have a right to migrate north and south freely. The fish have a right to return to their homelands and spawn. The natural rights are returning, and we're seeing that for the first time in a much different way. Most recently is on the Klamath Basin. The water is doing what it naturally does and flowing its way to the ocean. And we got to see young natives from the Klamath tribe kayak down and be part of that experience. We're watching the salmon and the suckerfish return and finding their way home. It's imprinted into their DNA. That's their natural being. That's the natural law taking place in the fiber of their DNA, telling them they must come home. And so when we disrupt that natural law, there are consequences. And we've seen the consequences over the years of how the land has changed and has not been able to sustain multiple species and hasn't even really sustained us very well in some ways. And so we have to learn how to figure out what that balance is so that we are protecting both that flora and fauna and ourselves and get back to a natural law rather than just the law of nature.
Great example in the Klamath. That's just one of the best conservation and rewilding and returning to home examples that we have in our current time. So thanks for that reminder. It's necessary to be hopeful. Where else do you see opportunities to further natural law?
I think right here in Central Oregon, it's around what are we doing with water here? What does that look like? And how do we ensure the aquifers are charged in the right way so that the water balance is here? Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting for. Really? Water's for drinking. It's what makes us humans. It's what keeps us alive. 70% of us is made up of water. And so how do we get back to that mindset that, that is the more natural law for us? And we can find that out while still being able to sustain each and every one of us in the balance that we need so that we have a healthy system here. We have healthy farming continuing to take place in agriculture, a healthy ecosystem that functions in a way that we have forest lands and we're protecting those ungulates in the area while also ensuring salmon can return in abundance. There's still hope here. And we're going to talk a little bit about more kind of where we're at with urban planning.
Yes, we will. I think that's a good transition. We've got a question and answer coming up, and then we'll get back to a few final questions. I could hear from you and chat with you all day long. So thank you so much for setting aside some time to be with us tonight. So the way that the question and answer is going to work is many folks chimed in advance and shared their questions. We wish we had enough time to answer all of them now. Perhaps we'll follow up with Chuck and see if he would be willing to share his thoughts on some of the remaining questions we're not able to get to. But Lace is going to relay some of the questions that folks shared in advance. So Lace, do you want to come up and do that?
And I know that's probably disappointing to some people who are wanting to ask a burning question, but it's also probably really assuring to some people who are like, let's get through as many as we can. So we'll start real quick. This question comes in from Malcolm Costello. He says, thinking of the link between natural law or rights of nature and Robin Wall Kimmerer's promotion of a revised Pledge of Allegiance in braiding sweetgrass, do you think we could use the K-12 education system to help kids build concepts around respect and responsibility for the land?
I absolutely do. I think that we should start even preschool in understanding what our relationship is to land. It's about reciprocation. It's not about dominance. Years ago, I was very, very fortunate when I worked for City Volunteer Corps of New York. Somehow I got stuck on this committee I didn't really want to be on. There was a look at history books in the school system. And since I was the only native, there was we want to know about native cosmology. We want to know about native beginnings. I was like, oh, okay. So while this sounds like I'm starting a bar joke, I'm having dinner with an imam, a Catholic priest, a Protestant minister, and a rabbi. And we're at this dinner after a long day of talking because I thought it was very progressive. And this is time Mayor Giuliani had said, education, let's look at history books, let's talk about what's in, what's not in them. And we were just talking about how religion is even barely touched on in history books or rhetoric, K through 12. And we were really looking around the 10th grade level history program in high school. But I was talking to the group about my own creation story, and it was the rabbi who leaned over to me and says, there's been a lot of misinterpretation. Even all of us here all believe in the Old Testament. I was like, okay. He says, it's not dominance. The original word, the old Aramaic Hebrew word, is actually stewardship. Could you imagine what the Judeo-Christian world would be if it hadn't been changed in Latin to dominance and had remained stewardship in Genesis? So that could have changed our entire education system in my head of teaching that relationship is a reciprocal relationship you have with flora, fauna, and land and water, rather than the ideals that have taught us that we must dominate these things. Because if we're stewarding them, that's a different type of mentality.
All right. From Pete. Members of President Trump's administration, joined by senators like Mike Lee of Utah, have called for the United States to sell or otherwise transfer federal lands to private parties or to state and local governments. Your experience in D.C. and in Oregon gives you a special perspective on the pros and cons of the idea of privatizing public lands. What opportunities, if any, do you perceive in the federal government's apparent willingness to privatize federal lands, and what risks, if any, do you perceive?
Well, I'll give my native perspective first. First right of refusal. Once we get that in order, then we can talk about this other stuff. But until then, I really don't have much more of a comment.
All right. Where is the legal battle with the Trump administration after they withdrew the government from the Resilient Columbia Basin Agreement between the four tribal nations, Yakima, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Nez Perce, and both Oregon and Washington?
I am an officer of the state of Oregon. So that being said, there was the state is under litigation, and looking at that litigation, but overall it was a disappointment, because let me be clear. I was in the administration when that was negotiated. I was part of the administration negotiating that agreement. And a lot of us didn't have a whole lot to say. Eventually, we were just told, you need to come up with your portion of the money. And I just remember CEQ telling me, hey, you're responsible for Roosevelt Lake. Chief Joe's Dam's above you. You need to come up with X amount of money towards this agreement for 10 years. Okay, am I going to ask Congress for appropriations? Nope. Figure out in your budget where that money's coming from and make a commitment for 10 years. Okay, that happens. But overall, when you looked at the agreement, you realized nobody was getting what they wanted. That's part of compromise. States weren't getting what they wanted, tribes weren't getting, the federal government wasn't getting what it wanted either. And so, but what it did do, it got us to talking, at least. It stayed our time in court, which is what you really do want to get, is you just want to get out of the court and talk to each other and see where you can find those common ground. And now we're back, of course, in court, and so that's a whole different way of having to do things, where the judge ultimately gets to make the decision rather than the sovereigns and their staff who know what's happening on the ground. And, it takes away, takes the knowledge that Austin has of his relationship every day of what he sees, and that he could have gotten done with those funding for his tribe, with the state, and with his partners, and places it into a judge. I have nothing against judges. They're very smart, but for me, I want to put it in the hands of the professionals that know what they're doing every day on the ground.
All right, we have a question from Liz, who says, if you were to be inaugurated as the director of the National Park Service again, right now, magic wand style, what would be your first action, considering the current state of the Park Service, and what would you focus on or encourage others to advocate for?
Well, first, I'd stop letting people go. We worked extremely hard, the entire administration. During the Inflation Reduction Act, we knew that the National Park Service, when I joined, we were about 21,000 staff members. But we knew that the real number that we needed was closer to between 25 and 27,000, which is kind of where the National Park Service had been a decade before, but we probably even needed more than that. But if we could get back to around 25 was a good sweet spot for us, that would get us more boots on the ground, out in the field, doing the work of cultural and natural resource protection and meeting the needs of the American people. So I was advocating for more funding, and where could that come from? And I'll just, how the sausage is made. I'm sitting at home. I get a call from a friend of mine who is negotiating with the Energy Natural Resource Committee in the Senate, who says, hey, how much money did you say you needed to bring on, at least 2,500 more people, between 1,700 and 2,500 more people? I said, $500 million. Okay. What do you mean, okay? I'm talking to the chairman of the committee. We're going to see if we can get that in the IRA. Whoa. That's not how this is done. You don't just get to call me up. I have a lot of people I need. Click. Yeah. So I'm panicking because there is a process, of course. It has to go through congressional affairs and my staff to the secretary's staff. The secretary's staff then present it to the DepSec. DepSec presents it to the secretary. Secretary calls me. I do a presentation about what I want, and then she sends it to her congressional staff, who then make a proposal. There's a whole process. I just know somebody on the committee. That's it. And so they call me back 45 minutes later and said, you're in for $500 million, but here's the deal. You can not hire anybody in the region. You cannot hire anybody at headquarters. All these boots have to be on the ground. And I started to say something. It's okay. DepSec's here with me. He's going to call you in 10 minutes. And I hung up, and the deputy secretary called me. He goes, don't worry, Chuck, I got your back. Already called the secretary. Thanks for sending us the information. And that money for the IRA was just for that. We were on a path to hire 1,750. Before I had left, we had hired 800 of those folks because we know that's the boots on the ground we needed. That would have gotten us closer to about 23 to 24,000 staff plus seasonals. And yet that's not what we're seeing today. Matter of fact, the only money they were able to claw back from the IRA was the money that was for the hiring of the rest of those numbers. But instead, they decided to lay off those folks who had just been brought on in the last year and further reduce the number. And so to me, if I was brought back in, first I'd stop the hemorrhaging and then start talking about how do we start putting better boots back on the ground.
Okay, I've got one more question from Michael. And we've talked a little bit about salmon in the Klamath River, so I think this is a good one. In 2019, the Yurok Tribal Council recognized the rights of the Klamath River, and since then we've seen salmon return to the Sprague River for the first time in over a century. For those of us who are not Indigenous, but who are inspired by the principles of treating the environment as a relative, how can we respectfully and effectively advocate for the legal recognition of nature's rights within Western legal frameworks? And what role can allies play in supporting Indigenous-led efforts while honoring their sovereignty and worldview?
It's a great question. And I teach this as a class if you want to take it. It's an entire term. There's a lot of reading. The short answer is, first, I just want folks to, because a lot of people feel this is a huge lift. It's a huge lift. How do we get there? How would we do that? I think we know in this capitalist society, we consider companies people. We've given corporations personhood. It is not that big a jump to give nature personhood. If the dollars that are in my pocket here are free speech, why cannot I, as a human being, speak on behalf of flora and fauna? It's not that hard. It's just, do we have the will to legislate that? It could start at your city council. It could start in your county regulations, in your land use planning. It can start in your state legislature and eventually make its way to the federal legislature of giving those rights and recognizing that they have rights. If a business can have a right and stand as a human being, a creature that is a living creature can have a right and you can speak on its behalf. A lot more complicated than that, but that's easy.
Thank you. So we have about 10 or maybe 15 minutes to go in our conversation, and I want to let's turn to Oregon. And this is a group, as I mentioned during this conversation, we all need reasons to be hopeful. When you think about Oregon and its future trajectory, what gives you hope?
There's a lot of hope in Oregon. That's one of the reasons I came home. I could have taken a job in DC and stayed there for the next 5-7 years and done some really fun work, I think. But I knew the real work is still here at home. We still, as Oregonians, love nature on a multitude of levels. And it's just figuring out how do we harness our commonality around that. I mean, I don't care if you live in downtown Portland or you live up on the end of a forest road, Oregonians have a deep appreciation of the outdoors, a deep appreciation of wanting clean air, clean water, protected forests. We have the most diverse ecosystem of any state. And people ask me all the time, like, I don't care if I'm on the coast or I'm on the desert, I'm on the high plateau, I'm in a lush forest. Oregon was a wonderful training ground to understand the multitude of different type of ecosystems and what it takes to preserve and protect them. And so there's a lot here for Oregonians to celebrate as we look on what we need to do and how do we do that in a time where our biggest existential threat is climate change. I feel very lucky that when I left federal service, immediately Governor Kotek said, hey, what I need you to do is look across, and I'm going to eventually do this thing called climate resiliency, but I need you to kind of take a temperature and get back to me. When I was director of the National Park Service, we updated our climate resiliency strategy, and it was a great process, and the staff there did a wonderful job, but I laid out a framework of the strategy that I wanted them to follow, and it was based on to ensure that it had parity and equity with the other bureaus. Again, I was very proud to work with Martha Williams, Tracy Stone Manning, Camille Tootin. We all had said we are going to pick our heads up, look across, and do landscape scale ecosystem restoration connectivity. And so for the first month I was back, that's all I did. I spoke to every director and their staff, and I went through and I developed a ecosystem function structure outline around climate resiliency, and to my surprise, Governor just adopted it, and that's what we based her Executive Order 2526 on. And then I had the good opportunity to help write part of that out, and it's all about resiliency, but it's not the doom and gloom of climate. It's what we can do as Oregonians, whether it's the built environment or the natural environment. And to me, that gives me a lot of hope that we can build a plan together. We can look at each community and ask what the answers are, because those answers are in each and every one of you to help us figure out what that path forward is about being resilient.
Great, thank you. We're slowly backing our way into land use, wink, wink. But before we do that, so LandWatch's mission is to defend and plan for Central Oregon's livable future. I like to think that livability is it's a sort of a differently prioritized list depending on kind of who you are and how you hope to experience this place. But it's likely that the same core elements are on everybody's list. So I'm curious for you, what about Central Oregon, having it or having it for the first time, makes it livable into the future?
Oh, it's always going to be about water. First, cool, clean water, because without it, you can't survive as a human being. And how do we ensure that that is in every household, that we continue to make sure the aquifers are recharged, that it's in the river system, then it not only provides for the species that need it, but for us as human beings. Next is healthy forest systems, which means that we're not having to face conflagrations over and over again every season of these wildfires. How do we get back out there and start really working on the landscape so that we get not only just natural burns, but actually real traditional planned burns to get those fuels reduction down so that it's much more livable. I just remember those 5 summers right before I left, couldn't even go outside. And then third is just, for me, it is around our planning. How do we plan together? The best part about us as Americans and under our First Amendment right in our process is that we get to have a voice. We all get to have a voice in our planning. And I always get upset when I ask somebody and they'll be complaining. I'm like, well, did you go to the meeting? Well, no, but why didn't you go? You had a voice. You have a chance. I don't really want to hear your complaint. Sorry, but thank you. If you had a chance to go voice that, I want to back you or I want to argue with you if I do, but I want to know that you did your part by being a part of the union, by trying to offer your suggestion, your idea. Even if you were against it, it should be on the record.
Great. Okay. Hot take. Oregon's land use system, its secret weapon or an impediment to progress?
Both. Both. I like to tell people I'm a recovering planner. I think my tribe punished me for a year by making me a planner. Not to any planners out there, you guys are great. Love y'all. I just spoke last week at the Western Planners Association because God bless every planner. I spent a year being a planner for my tribe and having to look at it. And my words to them, and one of the things that we haven't done, we were such a leader for the last 50 years in urban planning, in urban growth planning. And then I would say for the last almost 20 years now, we've kind of rested on our laurels about it. We haven't really taken a much deeper look at what has done really well. We always talk about what's really done well, but what have been our challenges and what are we doing to fix those challenges? Or what are we not implementing that we said we were going to implement because there are a lot of things we haven't implemented that we said we were going to implement when we wrote those urban planning rules and those urban growth boundary rules that we should be implementing. And my big concern about that is I don't want to see what could happen to us that's happened to California, where the insurance companies are leaving. We already have systems in place that we're just not using under land use laws that could help protect homeowners to ensure that we have insurance going and your premiums are not going up. That was thought about 50 years ago. We had planned for it, but we're not invoking it. And so it's both. And I think that we should take the time to really do the analysis of that and see what's working, what hasn't been working, and then what have we not been using, and let's start experimenting to see if it really will work.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. We were talking a little bit about your home in Pendleton, and you were describing that, yes, it's a small community, but you're starting to see examples of some of the things that us here in Central Oregon have been experiencing for a while, which is people wanting to kind of chip away on the edges outside of the urban growth boundary, and quiet communities. What's one little development here or there outside of an urban growth boundary? I'm curious what your experience has been like out in Pendleton, and if you're kind of seeing that happening.
We are, and Pendleton. Pendleton's in a bowl. It's in the valley, but the next urban area, matter of fact, it's Mike and I's other best friend, Hill Ranches, owns what's within their urban growth boundary. At some point, the city wants to purchase that land so that they can build there, but they're not. He's not ready to sell yet, which is fine. It's still very good, strong, farmable land, and it's producing wonderful wheat. So they're looking at other areas that originally, which was funny, in the 1970s, they encroached on the reservation and didn't realize it. Matter of fact, where Mike grew up as a kid, they built an entire development. The tribe sat back. We watched them put in the pipes. We watched them put in the roads. We watched them plat the land. And then we watched them put in the power lines. We let them put in a few houses. And then we said, whoop, you're on the reservation. What? We're on the reservation. That's not yours. That's ours. Well, what about the infrastructure? It's ours now, too. You should maintain it, though. You built it. It's a good lesson for them. But we are seeing it, and it's encroaching. I live right on that edge. The Neps and the Kellens have been to our house. When my wife and I were looking at a house, I was telling you, we looked at one of the houses that was on the other across the street. My wife really wanted like the backyard because it looked up to the mountains and it was an open field. And I said, we're not buying there. And she says, why not? It looks beautiful. I said, you're scared of wildfires. It will come eventually through that field and come right up to the house and burn this house down if we buy this house. But if we go across the street, we'll have not only that house to block it, but the roadway and then our house. And our insurance premiums won't go up. Oh, so we bought the other house. Because, we're trying to figure that out. What are we doing in our town in Pendleton? And I do feel for the urban planning there. And we've had the same discussion, that city council's having that same discussion. What do we do next? How do we take an evaluation of the successes and challenges that we've had in Oregon, and how do we redevelop those not only for the county, but how do we influence that at the state level?
Thank you. Right now, and everybody is sympathetic to the reality that we need a lot more housing, and there are so many ways to approach solving that problem. And it feels like if we can stay true to our core, which is what has made Oregon such an incredible place to live for the last 50 years, and planning may not be perfect as it is, but if we stick to what set us up so nicely for this moment, how we solve that problem in balance with the land use system could set us up really nicely for the next 50.
Absolutely. But if we continue to live with this idea that you have unlimited wants with limited resources, we're going to continue to build these mega houses for 2 or 3 people rather than what are our real needs. And that's what I'm seeing. And that's, I know there's a housing need, but let's be real about what our real needs are. How much square footage do we really need to have an enjoyable house?
Yeah, well said. I'm going to put you on the spot here. We're wrapping up. You are such an incredible storyteller. Is there perhaps one more story that you'd like to share with us?
Ooh. I will say only because, like many Americans, I think I am surprised and a little saddened about what's happening to the East Wing. The White House is a very special place. Um, it's a very special place. It is the people's house. And I didn't fully understand that. So very early on in my tenure as the Director of National Park Service, most of my days when I was in Washington, D.C. were broken up into 15 and 30-minute increments. Bob's here, who I worked with for years. I've known Bob. Bob's a wonderful guy. He's retired from National Park Service. He ran an entire division himself, but he knows that the director's schedule is just finite when you're in there. And I was on my way to work, and I go to look at my schedule, and all of a sudden, there's a 4-hour block, and it just said WH. I was like, what the heck is this? So I get in the car and I dial my assistant, Millie, and she's like, what's up, boss? I said, 4 hours, WH. Funny thing, turns out you're the chair of the White House Preservation Committee. I'm what? Yeah, we own the White House. Well, we own everything, the walls and stuff in it. You're fortunate as a landowner and a house owner, GSA owns the roof, so that's their problem. Millie, I don't find this funny. So what do you mean? She goes, well, you got to go and you have to tour all 135 rooms of the White House. And it's going to take you 4 hours. You have to go with the chief usher and the chief curator. And it was a fantastic day of looking at every nook and cranny of the White House and seeing just how it functions and meeting the staff who've been there for decades, who don't care who the president is, but they are dedicated to the White House and to the American people and preserving the history of the White House. I got to see the charred doors from the War of 1812 on the basement floor, which was originally the first floor. And when my counterpart from Canada came and I showed him that, I had us do up a fake invoice and charged him for the burned doors. Because a lot of people don't know it was not only British troops, it was Canadian troops who burned down the White House. I think he framed that and put it up in his office. But eventually I had to host my first meeting of the Preservation Committee, and my charge was to review all these applicants who volunteered to sit on the committee. This is not my background. And I get to the White House, and I'm sitting there, and I take a picture because it says Chair Charles Sams, and the First Lady's joining us, so she had made sure that we were using the White House china that day for the coffee service and the desserts. And President Lincoln's looking over the fire in the state dining room, and I wrote to my wife, WTF, how'd I get here? And she just said, own it. And they all show up and we're introduced. I asked them all to introduce themselves, and they're introducing themselves. And they were just an impressive group of former professors emeritus from Princeton, from Stanford, 17th century art, 18th century furniture making, textiles. And I feel like I'm just getting smaller and smaller in my seat. And then finally it gets to me, and I just stand up and say, on behalf of the president and myself, I want to thank you all for your service in joining this committee. Each of you are distinguished in your own right, and I want to reassure you that any and all suggestions that you give will go completely unvarnished to the president directly. But if there's a salmon issue, I'm your guy. If the president wants to put a creek right through the middle of this White House, I'm your guy. If the chef even needs help on how to prepare the salmon, I'm your guy. And Dr. Biden was very kind, and she got up and she reached over and grabbed my hand and she said, Joe and I are just pleased that you accepted the offer to come serve.
Please give a warm hand for Chuck Sams.